Hello, hi everyone. A very warm welcome to our webinar, Resource Management Mistakes Not to Repeat in 2024. My name is Nora, and I'm very pleased to be your host for this webinar. My personal passion is to unleash the potential of organizations and people by tapping into the future of work and creating more productive, adaptive, human, and joyful ways of working. I am very excited for you to join us today. We have the highest number of people joining us, so it's a very exciting and special way to kick off the new year. And I am so much looking forward to an insightful session with all of you. This is the 6th webinar of our new webinar series called LEAP, Igniting the Future of Resource Management. And through this webinar program, we're really hoping to reinvent the traditional approach to resource management and unpack fresh, inspiring perspectives for the community, for you, on how this could look like. And you might be wondering who is facilitating this program. Run is a resource management software solving the very challenge of matching work to be done and finding the best suited people for the job. We will use the last 15 minutes for questions and answers, so please feel free to capture any questions you might have and submit them in the Q&A section of Zoom so that we can cover them later on. And also feel very free. I saw some chats already, some messages popping up in the chat. Feel free to use the chat and share your thoughts on what is resonating. Just make sure to send to everyone and not just to the speakers. Next up, I would love to introduce the stars of our webinar, Martha and Gary. Martha Arias is a distinguished leader in resource and capacity planning, as well as project and portfolio managing, specializing in forecasting, strategic planning, and operations. Under her guidance, teams have consistently reduced costs by $2 million annually through resource efficiencies and decreased outsourcing while increasing utilization rates. She's also an advisory board member for the Resource Management Institute, and you could call her a trailblazer in her field while she's combining strategic vision with hands-on expertise to drive organizational success. And a fun fact about Martha is she's not only an incredible professional, but she also has a black belt in Taekwondo. Hi, Martha. Welcome to the webinar.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
And next up, our second wonderful guest in our session today is Gary Ward, the founding member and director of a centralized resource management office at Guidewire Software, leading a global team of resource managers who support the professional services business across America, EMEA, and APAC. He has over 20 years of experience across multiple domains in business operations and resource management. He is also a regular content contributor and speaker on the theme of workforce and resource management, like he's doing today. He is, just like Martha, also an advisory board member of the Resource Management Institute, the RMI. And a fun fact about Gary, he is not just enthusiastic about resource management, he also has a passion for psychoanalysis and likes to combine these two lenses in whatever he does. So I think that's an incredible combination. Welcome to the webinar, Gary.
Thank you, Nora. Glad to be here. And hi, everybody.
So I'll pause sharing my screen. Wonderful. And let's kick off with our discussion today. We've got a very exciting topic. We're just starting off a completely fresh and new year. And this is a wonderful time to take stock, look back at the past year, what resource management mistakes we've seen there, and also use those insights and lessons learned to make 2024 an incredibly successful and good year for the resource management community. So I would love to kick off with a question to you, Martha. What were the most common resource management mistakes you have observed over the years?
Sure. I would start off with my top three things. First off, I would say not enough leadership support. I think that one is really critical, especially if you're a new resource management team and you're new to the company in terms of like your value and what the team is bringing. So first off, I would say leadership championing the team, having an executive sponsor that can help vocalize the value of resource management and encourage the support and engagement of your team from the rest of the organization. So that's number one. Number two would be, while you're kind of in this launch stage, too much focus on the inward workings of the team and not taking the time to kind of pop up your head and look around the organization, and understand what the organization needs. Good processes are always good, but they won't solve everything. And if your processes are wonderful, but no one knows about them and what the results are, then you'll be frustrated with that lack of traction across the organization. And then lastly, I would say not understanding your customers' goals, and customers can be any leader across the organization, right? So really spend a significant amount of time understanding your customers' needs and talking with them, understanding, what their goals are for the year, and think about, how you can help move the dial for them. Like, how can resource management help them and support them in their goals?
Fantastic. A follow-up question, Martha. You talked about understanding your customer needs as a resource manager. Do you have any practical advice how a resource manager could go about really understanding, empathizing with those customer needs and goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say spend time with your customers, do quarterly at minimum sync ups with the different executives across the company, especially, periodically after your company's organizational goal setting time frame. So that might be a good time to talk to different counterparts and say, hey, what are your goals for the year? How can we partner? These are my goals for the year as a team and as a department.
Nice.
And how can we partner and enable each other? And I think that helps unlock those discussions where you can kind of take those notes and say, okay, this team is really looking to improve upon this. And then how can we support them as a resource management team?
Fantastic. And I love your framing around how can we partner and enable each other, which also helps with the other 2 points you've made around increasing organizational awareness about resource management and communicating the value. So those were some great, mistakes you have observed in the past. Thanks so much for sharing those. I'm curious, Gary, what would you add? What were some of the mistakes in your career you have observed happen over and over again? What are the most common ones?
Biggest mistake I've observed, and I loved Martha's answers, by the way, and I agree with all of them. And we have some sort of a crossover here too, which is nice. But biggest mistake I've observed across the board is investment, right? And we think of that kind of that phrase, you've got to speculate to accumulate, right? It suggests that you have to, take a chance or roll the dice on resource management. Now, I'd prefer to probably refer to that as factuals to actuals. What do I mean by that? There's a ton of information out there about the efficacy of resource management. That's not in doubt. But that being said, the investment needs to go beyond dollars, and this is where it ties into some of what Martha was speaking about. Resource management has to have autonomy, has to be empowered to make decisions in order to deliver positive outcomes. It must have a seat at the table in that respect. And, it requires advocacy in the organization. If a resource management team remain, let's say, reactive, tactical, or purely administrative, you've lost an opportunity to hold a competitive edge, right? And particularly miss the true value proposition of what RMO can bring to an organization. So again, if RMO is not empowered, advocated for, trusted, invested in the right way, I don't think it can reach its full potential. So it's absolutely critical, and it's the one that you see more times than not.
Yeah, beautiful. On the point of the resource management function needing to be empowered and acting autonomously, do you have any advice for the audience? How can you gain that right to be at the table?
It's a great question. We have to be speaking with some level of authority as experts in our field, right? And we need to lean into that too, and not shy away from it. Oftentimes for resource managers, they're talking to all levels of the organization, C-suite included. That's not the most comfortable position to be in for everybody. But what I'm suggesting is leaning into that opportunity and highlighting your value and your worth. And you do that by quick wins. What's the low-hanging fruit? What are the quick wins where I can deliver something here? Equally, if you're not necessarily delivering a solution or having a plan for something, it could be that, hey, I've identified an issue in the organization. I'm raising it to you and making you aware of it. Here's what I think. This is my assessment of it. Let's tackle it together.
Yeah, becoming a strategic advisor to the business, to the leadership team, so they really understand the value, not just on a tactical, but also strategic level. I love that. Thank you very much, Carrie. Awesome. The next question I would love to unpack and explore with you. Could you share a personal story of a resource management mistake you have made yourself? Feel free to pick up the question, whoever wants to go first.
I can go if you'd like, Martha. I don't. Look, we missed an opportunity early on in our ORMO build. Now, I should probably preface it by saying we did do it, but we didn't maybe put the same level of thought into it that we should have done upon reflection, and that is the ORMO Charter. It's a critical document, right? It clarifies the role, the responsibilities, and the value proposition of resource management for stakeholders, but it's undoubtedly also an orientating North Star for the team itself, right? What's the vision? Where are you going to? What are you trying to achieve, right? So this gets everyone aligned on, let's say, priorities, frameworks, how to articulate our value, as I said, but it goes beyond where you are today and where you're going into in the future, right? What's the direction? So it's also aspirational, right? It's not necessarily meant to be, here's all our processes in one place. Something else can serve that purpose, right? It should be aspirational, it should be clear and concise. And it should equally speak to executives. For example, starting that charter off with an executive summary, simple one-pager that speaks their language.
Nice.
It's a no-brainer, right? But I think what's most impactful and important about a document like this is that it serves externally to the stakeholder and it serves internally in terms of orientation for the team, for the director, whoever's in place handling resource management.
Wow, fantastic insights that you have shared. And thank you also for being vulnerable and sharing this journey with us. I think it's only human to, try out different things and really learn what works. And in hindsight, it's always easy to see with more clarity on what works well. So the team charter, I'm really curious. Could you share us a little bit about how you went about creating it and how it kind of evolved over time, what your lessons learned would be, and what the audience might learn from that experience?
Yeah, so we kind of started off with a focus on the executive summary, and it was to anticipate a change at the executive level. So it's nice because it kind of preempts some of that if that's ever going to occur for your organization, for example. But it was really kind of trying to map out what is the resource allocation framework. How do we communicate? How do we interact with various parts of the organization? And how do we level set on expectations there in terms of our roles and responsibilities, but equally, what are our expectations of others and what this process look like, right? So those interaction models have been pretty important. You can get down to the level of RACI charts in these as well. Probably don't want to be too exhaustive Someone will need to read it at the end of the day. You need to maintain it, right? But we've also included KPIs, for example, looking at the key performance indicators and the list just continuously grew, looking at the business, looking at some of the data points we have, our analytics roadmap, and saying, actually, there's a ton of other things we could be tracking here. So we've kind of essentially thrown the kitchen sink at it. You don't have to go about it. You keep it short and concise and just structured in such a way that it can be appreciated by the team itself, by your stakeholders, and particularly your executives and C-suite.
Beautiful. Thank you very much for sharing that, Gary. I wonder if there is a chance for our audience, everyone who's joining us today and might be watching the recording, to get a version of the team charter that you created with your team as an inspiration for how a team charter could look like, that they can then take and adapt to their own needs, just as a starter for 10.
Absolutely. Look, this is an ever-evolving thing. This is a living, breathing document that changes with the organization and changes with the org. That's the starting point, to let everybody know that. But I can certainly send something on that could be used as some form of template, but add to it, take away from it, whatever you need.
Awesome, because this is one of the key aspects of this webinar, is to be very practical and share actionable advice. And I think this is something everyone can take away and just feel inspired by and adapt. So thank you very much for being so generous to the audience. We will include this in one of our follow-up emails to you. So yeah, you can expect that at some point. And Martha, now I'm curious, after listening to Gary and his story, could you also share a personal story of a resource management mistake you have made yourself?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. One thing before I jump into that, I will just add on to Gary's answer kind of on charter and the importance of it. One also way that I've used this in the past, and I'm using it with my team now, is once you have your charter in place, you can actually use that for your road shows. Like if you're meeting with other teams and you're presenting, here's what we do, here's our value, here's our key focus, you can present that as part of that. You don't have to kind of come up with it as those meetings happen. You can have it ready to go. Your team can help present that, and everyone knows and is aligned on, this is our focus as a resource management team. And then one thing that, in terms of like the evolution of that, one thing that we've added this year is really talking about our values, like as a resource management team. So we added that as well. And that was, built out of the desire to be more transparent of how we make decisions, what trade-off logic we use, and why those things are the most important. And they do align to our corporate values as well. So individuals can see the connections there, and it kind of takes away that ambiguity around people maybe not understanding what your team is doing and why you're making the decisions and recommendations that you might be making on a day-to-day.
Great point.
That's fantastic. A great addition. Thank you, Martha. And it reminds me of the very first point you mentioned when we talked about the most common mistakes you have observed, right? Which was around the leadership support and not being transparent enough on the value of resource management. So this team charter can really be an artifact, an asset to help communicate and share that value in an easy and structured way. So yeah, phenomenal. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and then just going into your question, which was, a challenge or a failure that I've seen in the past, and mistake that I've made in the past is, I was in a situation at a prior company where, we had an executive who spearheaded, funding resource management at the organization. And we spent a lot of time, building out the team, the processes. We looked at tools and technology. We implemented them. Things were going great. And, outside of our control, our company was then part of a merger with another company, and is part of the redesign of the brand new, grand organization. We had a new executive. And even though we had our documents on our charter and our processes, to be frank, resource management wasn't familiar to this executive. And, we spent a lot of time socializing, educating, sharing our processes while we were there. And looking back, I would say the challenge, the issue that we faced and the mishap that we took was not asking enough questions. So
Mm,
we went in there with the mindset of we're going to share what we do, we're going to share our charter, we're going to share our processes, and they will see the value of resource management and how we are operating. And looking back, I wish I would have quadrupled, the amount of time that we spent understanding this new C executive's perspective,
yes.
operating goals, and then back into, okay, how do we then communicate to him on what the value is that we can bring and how we then can operate within this new organization, right? Because he came with a very specific perspective. And in
Right.
looking back, I don't think we really understood what his perspective was, right? We assumed that
Yeah. Like,
a lot
yeah.
of the legacy thinking would just be part of the new organization.
Mm.
And we didn't understand how different the cultures were. So that would be, the mishap that we took as a team.
I think that's such a nice illustration. Thank you so much for sharing the story of the third point you mentioned earlier around really understanding your customer, their needs and goals, right? So, one great way to do that is to ask questions, right? Create empathy. And earlier you mentioned, get time in your calendar with those key stakeholders, quarterlies, for example, to establish that relationship and really that deeper understanding of each other's goals. So yeah, it's a nice illustration of that point from earlier. Thank you very much.
Just on
Uh,
that point, it makes
yes.
me think of something as well, that I mean, what's important to them has to be important to you, right? Particularly at that level. So it really, I mean, it's a really great point, right? Understanding your stakeholders, understanding your C-suite, what's the perspective, where are they coming from, and what do they want to achieve? What are they trying to achieve?
Yeah.
Because what moves the needle for one person might not move the needle for another, right? So you can factor all of that in.
Yeah, nice. Nice. And you mentioned earlier, Gary, in your team charter, the RMO charter, you have KPIs, right? And I remember from our earlier conversations, it's quite a long list, about 25 or so KPIs. So
Mm.
might even be worthwhile to check your RMO KPIs and how they are kind of aligned to the leadership's KPI. How are you contributing to their success, right? Making that cross check and reference.
Yeah,
Yeah.
look, it's a lot of the time, and undoubtedly everyone that's on the call today, or eventually tuning in or listening to the recording, you talk about KPIs, you talk about performance, utilization, utilization, utilization. It's one. It's one metric, and it doesn't tell the story. There's so much more to this, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of value to really exploring what you can do with your data, and what you can achieve then from a metrics point of view. So,
Beautiful.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm sensing there is another resource management mistake we could frame around being too singularly focused on utilization as a KPI, and missing out on other metrics that matter. So maybe as a follow-up question, Gary and also Martha, feel free to answer, to reflect, what KPIs are you most excited about? What metrics really matter from your perspective? Maybe just a few, 1, 2 examples.
time to staff, allocation efficiencies, right? I think these are some of the kind of bread and butter, but there's a few other ones. I mean, even understanding your cancellation rate, your extension rate for resource requests and demand that comes in is really, really important. One of the newer ones we were looking at was portfolio rate of change, because we were finding it very difficult to articulate the churn in the demand itself, right? So being able to actually quantify that, measure that, is incredibly useful. Um, and but look, I'll also say that, at times you need to kind of fight finance with finance, right? Maybe the metrics that you're looking at, I mean, when we're talking about KPIs, we're talking about metrics. These are all quantitative, right? There is a qualitative element to these things as well. So maybe you haven't moved the needle on utilization, but were you capable of giving the organization time back? Whether that's a specific role or function or team, quantify. all right? Particularly if they're billable people. Quantify the hours that you made, what their bill rate is, what the opportunity there is to generate more revenue. It's important. So there's many kind of creative ways you can do this too.
Fantastic, nice. Martha, is there anything that springs to your mind?
Yeah, we talked about, all the things Gary had mentioned. I would just add two, dollars saved or value, recouped through your team. So one thing that we're looking at is, so we have a centralized pool of resources, and sometimes we'll have internal departments ask for resources in lieu of hiring externally. So we look at that as a cost savings and offset. We've looked at contractor efficiencies. We talked about on-time projects, time to staff, growth and volume. So you want to also just capture like little snippets of like, how much engagement do you have across the organization? Where is it coming from? The speed of your services. And I would also say just one footnote there is make your data visible and transparent to all. So have that dashboard out there, share
Nice.
it often and far and wide, especially if you have good return, right? You're showing good value to the company, make it transparent to everyone, at least leadership, VPs, executives. And then I would say there's non-quantifiable benefits as well, right? So you want to think about the team members in which you staff to projects, right? Or do they feel supported? Do they feel that they're getting good quality matches to their work and their skills? Are they getting stretch opportunities at a specific rate? We look at that too, because we want people to be growing and feel like they're growing at our organization. And then I would also say is non-quantifiable, even though you can technically quantify it, but how often do leaders come to your team to solve business challenges? I think that's just like a bit of a highlight of if you are seeing that leaders feel like resource management can solve a business challenge, that there is a view of value and that your team can deliver. So I think those are some good non-quantifiable as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Both of you, thank you very much. What I find extremely exciting is what you mentioned as the harder to measure ones around, I would summarize it as employee experience, right? You talked about how did the resources, the people that we, managed, feel, right? What's the quality of their experience? How are they able to grow as a result of their placement, etc.? So I think this is increasingly becoming a focus and more important to businesses. So the more a resource management function can foster the employee experience, the more value it will create now and in the future. Yeah. And also your point around, we talked about how often does resource management get invited to the table, right? So also having that as a measure, I think is very smart. So yeah, maybe more of a feeling at this point than a number as such, but also a great indication. And by the way, I love the idea of the dashboard. I think that's incredibly exciting to make the value of the RMO more transparent, right? I think a team charter can outline the value proposition with words. A dashboard that is perhaps even, regularly updated can be a second tool to make that very easy to understand and see. So fantastic practical ideas. Thank you.
It makes me think actually on that point of dashboards, and I completely agree with Martha. The visibility needs to be there, the transparency needs to be there. And data is funny because we talk about data integrity, we talk about what the data can do, how we can understand something, but again, that understanding, we can't take it, for granted that everybody interprets data in the same way. So real RM skill is storytelling with data.
Nice.
Right? Really looking at the trends, looking at the peaks and the valleys, the level offs, trying to understand, well, what does this mean? How do we, essentially what we're trying to do, right, at the root of it, is see around a corner, which isn't easy to do, right? So you need to kind of leverage the data in the right way. And yeah, I think people need to have access to that visibility, getting status reports out there. but contextualizing that, or what I'd call humanizing the data. What does that mean for the people on the ground? What does this mean for our projects? What does this mean for further operational efficiencies and delivering on customer success?
Yeah, very exciting. So if we frame it around our topic of today, a resource management mistake, we could probably all agree on is not being able to tell the story of the value resource management can bring well enough, right? So yeah, that's a great point, Gary. Thank you very much. We have a couple more questions. So to our audience, I would highly welcome and invite you to capture any questions that you have, as we will be moving to the Q&A in about 10-15 minutes. So now would be the perfect moment to capture your questions to both Martha and Gary. The next question I would like to ask to Martha: in your experience, what typically leads to resource management mistakes? What are the root causes of some of these repeating patterns that we have just discussed?
Yeah, I would say that there is still, in a lot of the organizations that we operate, resource management is still pretty new. And so it's a growing field. It's maybe not as well known as project management or even project portfolio management. So I would say that lack of true understanding of how resource management connects to your business, like end to end. So really spend time in thinking about that and how resource management connects to your customer life cycle, your deployment schedule, to how you operationalize the business, and really focus on telling that story, right? Connect the dots for the organization. It will feel repetitive at times, right? You feel like the message is out there, and then people are still trying to understand, right? How does it relate to them? How does it connect to their team and their processes? So I would say don't just be focused on the details of the operations. At least maybe have somebody that on the team is leading or maybe bringing the connections to the rest of the organization, right? Like, how are you doing that? Create structure around that. Again, maybe it's your roadshows, right? Maybe you think year after year, oh, look, there's this new team that launched, or this new executive, or this new partner. Let me make sure that I'm spending time to talk to them and understanding and sharing what we do and how we can be partners. Yeah, so I think that's one of the key areas. I would also say make sure you're connecting your business operations and resource management to the strategic goals of the company. So make those connections and share, the business critical outcomes.
Very nice. So I took away two main points of, looking at the root causes why resource management mistakes keep on repeating, occurring. Number one, it's a relatively new function. So there's some work to be done to tell the story, to connect, to increase awareness. And then it is also connecting to the strategy overall. What is the business trying to achieve? How can resource management, the RMO, serve and be in service of this strategy? Nice. Gary, are there any other root causes, any other patterns that you have come to understand in the space of RMO?
Sure. I mean, I love the question itself because of the way it's laid out, right? What typically leads to that kind of, to those errors, and they're highlighted of course in this setting as resource management errors. And so the clue is actually somewhat in the question too, which I like. But look, resource management, even if let's say we go back to where we started, you've got the sponsorship, you've got the investment. You're doing everything you can. You've built a team. You've got your charter. You've done your road shows. All of this good stuff, and somewhat ties into the KPIs too. What if you're, maybe you're moving the needle in some places and not in others, but some of the same age-old problems exist in the business, right? And a lot of the time that might be considered, you know, something surrounding resource management. And the reality is this really ties into resource management is not a silver bullet. It will not fix the entire organization.
What?
It
It
can
won't?
try. It can try. But I guess my point is that this is an ecosystem and it's part of that ecosystem, right? Can resource management show up, lean into the opportunity there, highlight some of the things that need to change, influence decisions? Of course, they can do all of those things, but it requires everybody to take part, whether that's a different team, a different function, and you know, really aligning on where things are at an organizational level. So what I meant to say really was that if you think there's still resource management problems, there probably are, but there are equally maybe issues in collaboration, issues in silos, issues in visibility, and they're not solely, let's say, owned by resource management.
Yeah.
So it comes back to some of what Martha was talking about.
Yeah.
Understanding your stakeholders, having the buy-in, the value proposition, talking to the right people, but collaborating too to get the organization where it needs to be. RMO can certainly lead from the front in that respect, but you can't take people kicking and screaming either. You need that support. You need to work together to get the organization where it needs to be.
Yeah, beautifully put. Maybe in another way you could look at it, it's almost a dance between the internal and the external focus, right? You don't want to be too heavily sided on the internal bit and nailing efficiencies and processes without communicating that to the wider business. And on the other hand, you don't want to tell everyone the value you're creating, but not delivering up to it. So maybe that's also a nice and helpful way of looking at the balance of internal and external focus of the RMO. Yeah.
That's
put.
absolutely right, and it does bring to mind the kind of the 3 C's. Like you mentioned one of them, the communication, right? The culture, the organization, and equally change management, because all of these things play a role here too.
Yeah, phenomenal. I think the topic of change management is a very interesting one for resource management, and we're actually currently planning a webinar on that. So yeah, would love to explore that more, and I think it's very, very relevant. Thank you. As a last question before we dive into the Q&A, I actually saw the first question popping up. Thank you very much. Keep on inputting your questions in the Q&A section. That would be lovely. To wrap us up in this part of our webinar, I would love to look at all the mistakes we have explored today, along with the root causes, and really focus on the lessons learned and strategies to prevent the repetition of these mistakes. What can we do as a resource management community to start and continue 2024 in a strong manner? What can we do? Which strategies would you recommend to the audience?
Right, I can take this one, or start at least. So, you know, to not rehash a lot of the stuff that we've already said, I would say, be flexible and have a continuous improvement expectation. The journey in resource management is continuous. So you'll launch your charter, you'll have good metrics, you'll share information. And this connects with something that Gary had mentioned about visibility, collaboration, and kind of getting out of silo, like operating in silos. So the work is never really done. There's always places to improve. The business changes. Your business might be changing now. You know, we have different economic cycles as well. So how you show value can evolve. So I would just say as well, just be open and flexible to, you know, constantly improving the way you operate and being open to suggestions from your partners, your customers, your, you know, your sponsors. Because you're constantly going to be climbing that hill, right? Like we're as well, like from like Run's perspective, technology continues to evolve and what our vendors are bringing to the table are evolving too. And so sometimes you have to plug into how is the business changing and how can we continue to optimize our processes? Is there new technologies? Is there a new way of operating? So
I love that.
Get in there.
Yeah, I would summarize it as the ability, the capability, the competency of an individual and a function like the RMO of being adaptive, right? And there is so much change happening and the velocity of change is certainly increasing. So how might we maintain up to what's expected, right? How can we actually stay ahead of the game? How can we be on that wave rather than being followed by the wave? So that's great, like flexibility, adaptability, constantly revisiting what are we doing, how are we doing it, how can we go about things differently. And I loved your reference to the other your partners of the RMO, like even other business areas and suppliers, and being really open-minded to what are we hearing from those different partners in our ecosystem. Thank you, Martha. Gary, what would you add? What are some strategies that you would advise for starting off 2024 in a strong way?
I have to tie into some of what Martha is talking about. One thing that's top of mind to me, because it comes back to that investment, if, RMOs should be strategic partners, to go back to that word partner, right? If they're overly administrative, tactical, reactive, firefighting, you've missed the point, right? Something's gone wrong. Now, it's not to say that, close the book, we're done. As Martha said, this is a continuous development, right? But just really leaning into and trying to make sure that the trajectory or the direction of the RMO is towards that strategic path. Sometimes that can only be done by decreasing administrative debt, whether that's on the people side, the process side, the technology side, just making those efficiencies. But it's also about maturing the function itself as you go, right? And I'd say it's kind of touches on the change management piece too, and operationalizing. I think RMOs have a place in bridging the gap between the company's vision and actually executing, right? So I just say you want to be that strategic partner. Do everything you can to get there. It won't happen overnight, but lean into the opportunity. Don't ask permission.
Ask for forgiveness later.
Show what you can do, and try and improve things.
Fantastic. I love those points. And it's a reoccurring theme in almost every webinar we've had so far, starting with Christine Robinson, is the shift from a more tactical administrative approach of resource management towards the strategic partnership level, right? And I love the way you framed keep on maturing the RMO function, right, continuously, which ties in so well with Martha's point, and to be that bridge between the vision, the strategy, and the reality, the execution. So yeah, well put. We have some time for questions now, so I'm gonna open up the Q&A section. Please feel free to continue to input your questions here and also to upvote any questions that you enjoy particularly well. I'm gonna start off with the first question. Can you share what were some of the biggest challenges you faced as a resource manager in a growing organization? So here we're also talking about maturity, right? As a business grows, what were some of the challenges you have observed and felt yourself as a resource manager?
I can take that. A couple of things come to mind. When we were in our build out, so early stages of actually building the RMO, we were in the privileged position of acquiring about 2 or 3 companies. So it really kind of threw a spanner in the works for how we were going to align practices, people, the work that we were going to do. So that was certainly certainly challenging. But I think I've actually probably lost my second point. So we can come back to it.
Absolutely. Martha, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I would. I would say in the early stages and as the organization is growing, the biggest challenge I've seen is uh, not having the trust there established between your requesters and kind of like the legacy way of doing things versus the new way of doing things. And that takes time. So I think there's a lot there in terms of like gaining trust. So it's not just like about understanding people's needs and empathizing, but also being able to deliver and show the efficacy of the delivery, right? Like we are leading to more satisfied customers. We are leading to faster implementations. We are leading to whatever it might be, right?
Yes.
XYZ. So I think for me, that's one of the ones. And then with the growth, as you're having new teams come in, new individuals join the company, you're growing so quickly that that change management is constant because you're having people come into the organization that haven't heard your pitch yet, right? So each time you're refreshing people on your processes, on your value, and you'll have new leaders come in and leaders, potentially move to other parts of the company. So I think those two are really important, just the change management and then the gaining the trust.
Yeah, fantastic points.
What's great about that is you end up perfecting it so well. Your
Yeah.
elevator pitch changes, the way that this pitch inside out, which is really, really good. But the question was kind of centered around that, growth, and the other thing that had come to mind that slipped my mind a moment ago was resource management is about capacity planning as much as anything else, right? You need to do that internally too. What's the critical mass from a resource management perspective? Because again, if there is any administrative work, for example, or other pieces to it and operational pieces to the work, the volume can amass pretty quickly, right? It's great news. The business is doing incredibly well, but you're now suddenly under pressure, which makes it even more difficult to get to that strategic place. You want to have more time to be in front of executives, building out a status report, using your dashboards, having the conversations, collaborating, right? You want more time for those things rather than some of the other exercise that we need to complete, right? So, and
Yeah.
again, the technology may help us get there too, right?
Yeah.
You make more efficiencies there. So
Yeah, that's the idea, the hope, the opportunity. Great.
right.
Thank you, Gary. I'm happy the second point came back to you. I loved
Yeah.
it. And next up, I would love to pick Michelle's question. Thank you for putting it into the Q&A. And Michelle is wondering, is there a specific size of company, some specific characteristics or problems to look for that would indicate your organization is ready for a designated resource management function? Michelle has worked mostly at smaller startups where this has not been a focus internally. So how do you know an organization is ready for a designated resource management function for an RMO?
Yeah, I can start here. I wouldn't necessarily look at size. I've actually worked at smaller sized companies, and by smaller, I mean several hundred employees. So I don't know if that's as small as maybe Michelle's example. But what I've seen is the organization seeming ready for it because the outcome drivers that were critical to the business were not being met. So for example, for a high-tech company that I was at, they brought in resource management because they couldn't figure out why their product development cycle was always running behind. For example, they were building products, and at that point I was doing RMO for product development within product development. And they would plan out the projects, they would work on the projects, and they would constantly get delayed. And I don't mean by months, I mean by several months, sometimes years.
Wow.
So very it was in the genetic life sciences space, so very complex products, very complex solutions. And that's why resource management was brought in. I've also seen it done as well when you have customers internally, perhaps complaining about lack of delivery. And in the case, really resource management in both the cases can really look at the demand of work, quantify it, and then give recommendations on, do we have enough people to deliver, right? It's that capacity planning part of resource management, the forward-looking forecasting, really getting a handle on how much work is coming in, how long does it take to do, and how many people do we need to deliver. So I think when you start seeing some of those key business drivers falling down, that's when companies start looking at resource management as a solution.
Fantastic. I wonder, Gary, is there anything that springs to your mind in addition?
No, I agree with Martha. I think there's some very obvious things to stand out. Like, is there a failure on the side of, some sort of forecasting framework, right? Is there an opportunity there? I agree that there's not necessarily a scale or a size that makes sense. I think you need to go back to what are the issues that are occurring in the business. There's plenty of case studies out there to help articulate that and when it's appropriate. But what's really occurring in the business and what are you trying to solve for? And 9 times out of 10, you could say, well, yeah, resource management has a place here. Whether that's on your financial forecast, your resource forecast, or more simply, the actual allocation and redeployment of the team, because most organizations, generally speaking, if they don't have them, have some level of silos going on, right? Which makes it quite difficult to allocate and redeploy the human capital in the most effective way, right? And an executive's always going to understand that and buy into that idea, because why would you have one team absolutely swamped and another one sitting around waiting for work, right? It just doesn't make sense. It's not efficient. So, so I'd go back to the root issues of what's occurring in the business and then make a case for it from there. But no specific size or number of people. I just look at what the issues are that are occurring.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you very much, Gary. To finish off, I would just like a very quick round for Kathy's question, or actually there's another one coming in. So what I will suggest is please feel free to continue writing down questions. What Gary, Martha, and I have agreed to do is to answer any remaining questions in a separate session that we will record for you, and we'll share this in a follow-up email with all of you. So feel free to use the remaining few minutes to keep on adding some questions. We're most happy to answer them separately after the session. And my final leap of the day, if you will, for you, Martha and Gary, is what inspires you in the space of the future of resource management? Now that we're entering a new year, what is your source of inspiration in the space of resource management?
I can kick that off. We've already mentioned, I think, throughout today that there's technology changes, there's business changes, there's industry changes. So, I mean, change is constant. That can be a bit frightening, but also exciting. I've always described resource management as kind of somewhat, shifting sand, right? You're trying to be as predictable as you can, but there's a lot that occurs around that. I'm excited by, the team's growth, the team's development, and seeing that, again, that the function itself mature. To Martha's point earlier on, this is still nascent, right? It's not known everywhere. I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm the chandler of my friends. They don't know what I do. It doesn't matter how many times I describe it or give the value proposition, right? They just simply don't understand it because it's not in the vernacular for everybody.
Have you shared the team charter with them, the RMO charter? Maybe that could help, or a dashboard.
Look, there's even like today or in person, you get a room of full of RMs, irrespective of the company, the tenure, the experience. They're sharing a lot of the same issues and problems. I think that's exciting because it means no one has fully solved this yet. right? So there's so much more work to be done and creative ways of getting there, and networking and collaborating to do that too. So it's an exciting space to be.
Beautiful. Thank you, Gary. And I can add from my personal feeling that this is, one of the purposes of running this webinar is to allow for that community to share experience and knowledge and grow together to make the leap into a more enjoyable and adaptive, effective resource management future. So yeah, I could not agree more. Collaboration is very exciting. Awesome. Thank you, Gary. How about you, Martha? What inspires you?
Sure. I would say that there is so much more value that we as, RMs and in the resource management community can show by the proper deployment of the function. So I feel like it's nothing but greenfield out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the sky's the limit, there's still so much growth in terms of the percent of companies that are deploying these types of teams. And so I think as a resource management professional, I feel like I've been steadily growing across the years and years in which I took on the resource management role. And I'm excited that, when I, have onboard people to my team, they're excited about it. They're like, this is new. Like, I can see the value that we're going to bring. And I think there's just so much growth out there in terms of building the awareness and just making the improvement at these companies that we're at, right? I think, again, it's an opportunity for growth for all of us.
Well put. Thank you, Martha. So from the bottom of my heart, thanks to both of you for being our webinar guests today, for being so generous and sharing your expertise, your experience, and also being vulnerable and sharing some of the resource management mistakes you have observed and experienced yourself firsthand. It felt like a very authentic and true conversation. So yeah, thank you so much for that. I feel very grateful for having you here with us. I'm excited to share what is coming up in our next webinar, just to give you a little bit of a sneak preview, what exciting topics we will have in the future. We will be focusing on the transformation of resource management through experimentation. And for that session, we're very, very excited to have Tabia and Sarah, both transformers at the organization The Ready, join us to explore this topic together. So we will be meeting on February the 7th. My colleague Irina is going to share the link to the landing page. We would be very glad and happy to welcome you back for that. And we will also organize a nice follow-up email to all of you so that we can share the team charter template that Gary will provide to us. Thank you again, Gary, for doing that. We will share the recording of this session, and we will also share the recording of the after the webinar Q&A final question recording with you. So my very last question for all of you, Gary and Martha, feel free to join as well. What I would like for you to share in the chat is, what resource management mistake are you going to avoid this year? I'm really curious. What are you taking away from the session? Which mistake are you going to focus on so that 2024 is going to be a very successful and happy, joyful year? Feel free to share some of your insights and maybe even, strategies for 2024 in the chat. Can be a keyword as well. Jennifer is sharing partnership. That's beautiful. That was a reoccurring theme today. Advisory, very nice. Perhaps this is a reference to being a strategic advisor to the leadership team. Efficiencies, Marianne is sharing, very nice. Deeper business analysis and improved execution. Beautiful, Gary. return on investment Mary is going to focus on in 2024. That's very nice. The value, and Claire is sharing the visibility of resource management. That's great. It goes hand in hand. We also have the importance of the RMO. Very nice, Cynthia. Thank you for sharing. Wonderful. All right. Well, I would say this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everyone, especially Martha and Gary, for joining us. And I wish you a very happy 2024 with a lot of resource management goodness and only few resource management mistakes. Take good care. Thank you.
Thanks, Nora. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.